Jimmy the bulldog was no ordinary hound for Dr. Augustus. In fact, this four-footed animal formed the window to the world to the working of the heart. Always tied and wrapped in wires, with many of times his feet soaked ankle deep into salt water, he allowed his master to conduct a lot of experiments. In fact, the first electrocardiogram of the beating of the heart was that of Jimmy's heart. Today, we have come a long way in the knowledge and the functioning of the heart. We have sensors which can also detect an impending heart attack. We have computer pictures that are taken and a video image can be created on the working of the heart. We have artificial pacemakers to make the heart beat according to the rhythm and the required needs of the body. Heart is a pumping organ of the body that pumps the vital fluid blood through a number of blood vessels. It's very interesting. In fact, it is so astounding to see how the heart beats. In a lifespan of about 75 years, the heart may be beating at least 2.5 million times. The human heart is the size of one's closed fist. In length, it may measure up to 12 centimeters and in width about 9 centimeters and in weight 250 to 300 grams. The heart is enclosed in a double-layered membrane, the pericardium membrane. The pericardium secretes the pericardial fluid which lubricates the surface of the heart. Let's have a look at the internal structure of the heart. The human heart is a four-chambered heart in which the upper chambers are called as the auricles and the lower chambers are called as the ventricles. There is absolutely no connection between the right side and the left side of the heart. The two auricles are separated by the interatrial septum and the two ventricles are separated by the interventricular septum. An auricular-ventricular septum divides and separates the right and the left side of the heart. The auricles communicate with the ventricles through an auricular-ventricular aperture that is guarded by valves. The right auricular-ventricular aperture has a tricuspid valve and a left auricular-ventricular aperture has a bicuspid valve. The walls of the ventricle are always thicker than the walls of the auricle, and in fact on the walls of the ventricle there are a number of papillary muscles. This is because the ventricles have to pump blood against the force of gravity, and the force with which blood should flow should be enough to reach every part of our body. The right side of the heart contains deoxygenated blood and the left side contains oxygenated blood. We must know what are the major blood vessels that enter and leave the heart. The right auricle receives the superior and the inferior vena cava that bring the deoxygenated blood. The left auricle receives the pulmonary vein that brings oxygenated blood. Remember, veins carry deoxygenated blood. It's only the pulmonary veins that carry oxygenated blood. From the left ventricle leaves the major blood vessel, that's the aorta, and it is carrying the oxygenated blood. From the right ventricle leaves the pulmonary artery with deoxygenated blood to be oxygenated in the lungs. Another important point to be noted here is pulmonary artery is the only artery in the body that carries deoxygenated blood, all arteries carry oxygenated blood. Now, how is the blood that is pumped into the aorta and the pulmonary artery keeping its one directional flow? Well, the pulmonary artery and the aorta have semi-lunar valves which prevent the backward flow of blood. Here's a beautiful illustration of the heart, and before we get to the functioning of the heart, let's quickly run through what we had already discussed. Two major blood vessels, we said, pour the deoxygenated blood into the right auricle, and that is the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. Simultaneously, in the left auricle, oxygenated blood is being received by the pulmonary veins. Two of them are shown here. Ventricles, the lower chambers, are the distributing chambers. They pump the blood. Well, the blood vessel that leaves the right ventricle is the pulmonary artery. You can see the pulmonary artery dividing into two branches, and very clear are the semi-lunar valves which prevent the backward flow of blood. Leaving the left ventricle is the major blood vessel of the body, that is the aorta. The aorta is to supply the oxygenated blood to every cell of our body. In between the right auricle and the right ventricle, very clearly shown is the tricuspid valve, and between the left auricle and the left ventricle is the bicuspid valve. When these two valves, that is the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves, close, they produce the sound lub. And when the semi-lunar valves in the pulmonary artery and the aorta, they close, they produce the sound lub and dub. The doctor records and hears clearly these sounds with the help of an instrument called as the stethoscope. But if you place your ear against the chest of any of your friends, the lub and dub sound is very audible. The muscles of the heart. As I mentioned, we have the papillary muscles in the wall of the ventricle which pump blood with great force. There are three important characteristics or properties of the cardiac muscles, that is contraction, self-excitability and rhythmicity. How is blood actually being pumped in the heart? The cardiac cycle comprises of a diastole and a systole. Diastole is when the auricles are in a relaxed state. The right auricle is receiving the blood from the superior and inferior vena cava, and the left auricle is receiving blood from the pulmonary veins. When it's in a relaxed state, as I mentioned, it's the diastole phase. When these two auricles contract, we say it's the atrial systole. The blood from the auricles passes into the ventricles. The ventricles are relaxed to receive the blood from the auricles. When the ventricles contract, it is the ventricular systole. Now when they contract, remember the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve close, the blood is pushed into the pulmonary artery and the aorta, and the backward flow of this is prevented by the semilunar valves. Once the ventricular systole is over, they enter the diastole phase, that is they relax, and the auricles have to start receiving the blood. Beginning with the diastole, followed by the systole of the auricles and the ventricles, and returning to the diastole phase completes one cardiac cycle. The blood that is pumped by the aorta into the arteries is under great pressure, and this pressure is called as the blood pressure, the force with which the blood is flowing in the arteries. An instrument called as the sphygmomanometer records the blood pressure. The values of normal blood pressure are 120 by 80 mm of mercury, that is the height of mercury column supported by the pressure of blood in the systole phase would be 120 and in the diastole phase would be 80. A person who records higher values, especially beyond 150 and 90, is suffering from hypertension, and a person whose values are below 120 and 80 is suffering from hypotension, that is low blood pressure. You must also know the role of the sino-auricular node, which we call as the pacemaker. It lies below the superior vena cava, the opening of the superior vena cava. In fact, it sets the pace, it establishes the heartbeat, and in the interatrial wall of the right auricle there is the auricular ventricular node, which facilitates the contraction of the walls of the ventricle. Wasn't it wonderful exploring the human heart and to see how it works and functions? There is some interesting information to be shared with you. Do you know when the first heart transplant took place and where? The first heart transplant was carried out on 3rd of December in 1967 in Cape Town, South Africa by a leading surgeon, Dr. Christian Bernard, with his team of 30 doctors. And the patient was Louis Washankashi. But unfortunately, in spite a leading surgeon conducting the operation, on 21st of December, Louis passed away. The first human transplant in India was done at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences on 3rd of August in the year 1994 by Dr. Venugopal. It was conducted on Devi Ram, who was aged 42.